friends and family. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Aki Smith, and I'm a caregiver to my father and founder of Hope for Stomach Cancer. Today's topic, dietary interventions for gastric and esophageal cancer. Practical tools for patients is extremely important. Nutrition is extremely important. After my dad's total gastrectomy and a year of oncology treatment, he went from his heaviest at 171 pounds to just 97 pounds. Looking back, I really wish we saw a dietitian at diagnosis. This would have spared us so much heartache because once my dad started to lose a little bit of weight, it actually snowballed to a lot of weight. And it wasn't just the weight that concerned his team of medical experts. It was the fatigue, the vitamin deficient neuropathy, the malnutrition, loss of muscle mass, and the stomach cancer cramping. All of it threatened next steps in terms of treatment. Proper nutrition is important to withstand oncological treatment, radiation, and even surgery. Without proper nutrition, we don't get the right vitamins and minerals, and we need it to fuel our body. Without it, our body becomes weak, and it severely limits our medical options. That's why I cannot wait to introduce you to Nancy. But before I do, I quickly wanted to go over some of the resources that we have available here at Hope for Stomach Cancer. We have the Receive a Hope in the Bag, which is a free patient navigational kit. You can get it shipped right to your house if you go to hopebagstomach.org. We also offer our Stage 4 support group, which is a Zoom style where we have 2 guest oncologists. Our next one is actually this Monday, and this is something that we do with the Esophageal Cancer Education Foundation. You could go to stage4support.org to sign up. We also offer a closed private Facebook group, which is at stomachcancersupportfb.org. It's a great group of patients, caregivers, and stakeholders that are helping with future programs. Lastly, we have our Hope webinars. Our next one is with the Stand Up to Cancer Gastric Cancer Dream Team. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at stocan.org, and I promise we won't be spamming you, right? It'll just give you a lot of resources and information on a monthly basis. I also wanted to share with you some of the resources that the Esophageal Cancer Education Foundation offers. If you go to www.fightec.org, they offer support group meetings, a patient and caregiver highlight, and some post-surgical guidance. With that, I wanted to say thank you, my friends. And here is our guest speaker, Nancy Jaffrey, MS RDN from UCLA. Nancy is the lead dietitian for UCLA of digestive diseases. Nancy was recruited in 2012 to help develop a comprehensive GI nutrition program to enhance care for patients with specific nutritional issues and to provide ongoing nutritional education to UCLA GI fellows, gastroenterologists, and other healthcare professionals. The GI nutrition program is now an integral part of the division's integrative digestive health and wellness program. So here's Nancy.
Thank you so much, Aki. Give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen with everyone. All right, hopefully you can all see my slides. So I want to start by just saying what an honor and pleasure it is to be here with you all and to thank Aki Smith and her family, as well as this wonderful Hope for Stomach Cancer Foundation that she started. And that I hope my presentation today will be helpful. And we're going to keep the presentation around 40 minutes so that we'll have lots and lots of time for your questions so that we can hopefully give you lots of good answers and advice and tips and tricks and all that good stuff for today. So as Aki mentioned, I'm a dietitian. I've had the honor of working at UCLA for almost 9 years now, which is amazing. And I've also had the pleasure of working multidisciplinary within UCLA, working with our hematologist, oncologist, as well as our surgeons to really get to know the ins and outs of what our different GI cancer patients need. So this presentation is really to give you some of those tools that I've acquired over the past several years. So to start our overview, there's a couple, what I think of as nutrition facts and figures for gastric and esophageal cancer that are really important that I share with you, because as Aki was mentioning, a lot of patients don't realize that at diagnosis is when we have to really start pushing nutrition support. We need to make sure the patient is well taken care of at the time of diagnosis and all the way through until they are hopefully cancer-free. So once we give you those facts and figures, we'll go over some nutrition interventions specifically for before surgery, during surgery, and after surgery. So we want to make sure, again, we're looking at the whole timeline and we're taking care of the patient that entire time. We're going to focus in on weight gain or weight maintenance, as well as symptom management, especially for some of these adjuvant therapies like chemo and radiation. And then we'll go into what we do after surgery to help the patient get back on their feet and hopefully start eating more normally. And then I want to talk about nutrient concerns and some common deficiencies that go along with the different procedures associated with these two types of cancers, because this is something that often gets forgotten about. Our doctors and our surgeons are wonderful, but this is not their main area, right? And so they don't always focus on what types of nutritional deficiencies can show up as a side effect of just having cancer, let alone the symptoms, and then of course the different treatment courses that are taken. So I want hopefully all of the family members and patients and caregivers who are in the audience today to have some of this information in their back of their mind when you go and visit with your doctor and your surgeon, and hopefully you'll have a dietitian as part of your team so that someone is keeping an eye on this for you guys. And then we'll give you some takeaway messages and we'll move on into the Q&A. So in terms of nutrition facts, studies have shown that as many as 40% of cancer patients will experience weight loss prior to treatment. Okay, so this is at the time of diagnosis. And you'll notice that when we look just at our upper GI cancers, it goes up to 80%. Okay, so I want you to remember that number, 80% of upper GI cancer patients at the time of diagnosis will have had some amount of weight loss. So it's very common in my clinic that by the time a patient has gotten to me, they've already lost 25, sometimes up to 40 pounds, depending on what their starting weight was. Okay, so it's really important that we are catching this as early as possible and we're stopping the weight loss as soon as possible. And it's not just about number on the scale, right? It's not just about weight loss. We're also looking at something called malnutrition. Okay, so malnutrition is not only weight loss, but it's the inability to take in sufficient calories, protein, carbohydrates, all the macronutrients to support the health and well-being of the body. It's often shown as loss of what we call our lean body mass. So our arms, our legs can show up in the chest. It can show up in the face. The ribs start to peek through, okay? And also loss of some of our fat, not abdominal fat, but like the fat in our face or the fat pads that are on our arms. We start to see all of that going down. And there can also be something called cachexia. You may have heard this term as well, which is basically a multifactorial syndrome characterized by this loss of lean body mass or skeletal mass, and also an inability because of that loss of mass to do certain physical activities, which could even include helping get yourself up from a chair or picking up a glass, right? And this can really affect things like appetite and ability to eat. And you'll notice that beyond weight loss, malnutrition during treatment is up to 40 to 80% of patients with our GI cancers, and that this often manifests as cachexia. So these numbers aren't to scare you, but they're really to put things in perspective, just how important it is that we start with nutrition support as soon as possible. And in part, this is because not only is it going to make our family member or the patient feel a lot better, they're going to have more strength, more energy to actually be a part of all the treatments that they have to be a part of. But what we've seen in the research is that those who are able to maintain not just their weight, but their lean body mass are more likely to get through their chemo and radiation on time without having to stop or change doses. They have better outcomes during surgery with less complications. They tend to get out of the hospital quicker, and they have better healing times. So all good reasons to keep your nutrition up and running. So what does that really mean? So before surgery, as I said, we want to make sure our patients are eating enough calories, protein, but as well as the other macro and micronutrients, carbohydrates, fat, water, vitamins, and minerals. And this is a really big blanket statement, and I promise I'm going to break it down in the next several slides for all of you. One thing that patients often don't realize they have an option of is appetite stimulants. So I just want to put that out there right now, that oftentimes our patients, because of everything that they're going through, they may lose that sense of appetite, that desire to eat. Food might not be so interesting, or especially during chemo and radiation, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, there can be taste changes, right? So if you're noticing, if you're the patient for yourself, your appetite is really super depleted, it's harder to get nutrition in, or if you're a caregiver or a family member, you're seeing that your family member is just really having a hard time, this is when talking with your doctor about the potential of an appetite stimulant, which is a medication that simply increases that desire to consume. And it really can make quite a significant difference. And it's important that we know that this is available and that we're asking for it earlier rather than later, right? It's something that our patients deserve to have if they need it. So you'll notice on the screen that I have for non-surgical cancer patients, their requirements are 25 to 30 calories per kilogram per day. This is dietitian speak. Okay, this is how we look at a patient. We go, okay, so what is their course of treatment going to look like? Are they going to be headed towards chemo and radiation? Are they going to be headed towards surgery? And we can then help to calculate out what their calorie needs are and especially what their protein needs are. When we have a surgical patient or especially a malnourished patient, those needs go up. So in order to explain this, let's come up with an example. So for instance, let's take a healthy 50-year-old male who weighs 170 pounds and is 5'11". So very healthy, he's got an active lifestyle. As a dietitian, when I calculate out his needs, I would estimate he needs somewhere around 1,900 calories and about 90 grams of protein. But this same man, if he was then diagnosed with gastric or esophageal cancer, his caloric needs could easily, just because of the cancer diagnosis itself, go up to 2,300 from 19. Okay. Not only that, if he's malnourished, I could easily be trying to get him to eat over 3,000 calories a day. And beyond that, with protein, his needs could easily be over 110 to 120 grams. So you can see that the amount of nourishment that is needed for someone with cancer is dramatically increased over someone who is healthy. And so these are really important facts that we need to make sure we're pushing with our family members, our patients, etc., is that eating the way that you used to eat before your diagnosis is not going to work. Your body needs more energy. It is actively fighting. An active fight requires calories and it requires protein. Okay. And you'll notice I keep talking about protein. So let me explain why I keep talking about protein. So protein is what helps us to build back our lean body mass, right? So our muscles are made of protein. They are not made of carbohydrates and they are not made of fat, right? We still need carbohydrates and fat, but not to the same degree that we need to bump up that protein. And I will often find, I get this all the time from my doctors or my patients, where patients will come in and they'll go, oh yeah, my doctor told me to just eat a bunch of ice cream or just, eat as many cookies as I want, just get the calories in any way you can. And what I'll say to them is, okay, so you'll see the number on the scale go up with that, right? If you eat a pint of ice cream every single night, that number on the scale will start to go up. But all of those calories and fat are going to go to your midsection. It's going to go to your abdomen. And that's not where we want to be gaining weight from, right? We want to be making sure we're building up the lean body mass because that's what's going to keep us out of the hospital, make sure we're healing good after our different treatments. Those are the things that are going to keep us out of malnutrition, right? And so I want to make sure that you understand that just pushing a bunch of pasta on yourself, if you're the patient, or on your person that you're caregiving for, it's not enough. We need to infuse those things with protein. And that's where someone like me can be so helpful, is we can be creative. If the patient is really nauseated and carbohydrates are very comforting for them, we can come up with fun ways and interesting ways and very tasty ways to get that protein in and still be giving them something that helps to quell that nausea. And again, we're going to give you some of those tips coming up real soon. All right, so how do we help to maintain weight if they're already at a healthy weight and they're able to maintain their lean body mass, or if the patient needs to be gaining? What are some things that we can do? So the first thing is, especially with upper gut cancers, it can be very hard to get a big volume in, right? So instead of thinking we need to be pushing more bigger meals on ourselves or on the patient, that's not going to work. More volume is not going to work. So instead of thinking more volume, we need to be thinking more nutrient dense for the volume that works for the patient. And this usually means smaller, more frequent meals instead of trying to pack in a really big meal a couple times a day. So I'm a fan of anywhere from 4 to 8 smaller meals per day, depending on how the patient does. And a small meal could mean that you are taking a balanced meal. So a balanced meal is going to have a good protein source, hopefully some vegetables if we can do it. We'll talk about ways to get those vegetables in, as well as a starch or carbohydrate. But we're just taking it from whatever a normal portion might be, which is usually kind of like a salad plate. We may have to cut it in half or even a third, but then we'll separate that out every couple of hours across the day, and we can still get that same volume in, but we're not putting it on a patient who can't get that volume in all at once. So it's same nutrition, but less volume, which makes it easier so the patient doesn't get overly full. One thing is changing the texture or modifying what we call particle size can really make a big difference for these patients. So especially with my esophageal cancer patients, if there's any swallowing issues going on, they may need to go to things that are pureed, blenderized, smoothie consistency, or even thin liquids, whichever works best in terms of that texture and that particle size. We can make all the meals fit into that and still make sure we're getting enough calories, protein, etc. When possible, we also want to try and include these high calorie foods. So I just want to say, first of all, not every gastric and esophageal cancer patient is going to tolerate fat very well. So fat, because of the way that the stomach is laid out, it rises to the top of the stomach, it sits there, and it can put a lot of pressure on the top part of the stomach. This can lead to nausea and reflux. So if you notice that within 30 to 90 minutes after a meal, you're getting really nauseated if you're the patient, or you notice if you're taking care of someone that they're starting to get more nausea or GERD, reflux type symptoms after the meal, they may not tolerate as much fat, and that's okay. We can find other ways to get these nutrients in. But if you are able to tolerate even small amounts of fat, olive oil, avocado, and avocado oil are wonderful ways to just drizzle on top of food. For every tablespoon you get in of olive oil or avocado oil, you're adding 120 calories. Okay, so you're really bumping things up without adding more volume. Okay. Also, if you are finding that fat is a little bit difficult to tolerate, you may do better with what's called MCT oil, or medium chain triglyceride oil. So the reason why this is easier is that it's a smaller molecule, right? So it's medium instead of large, which is what our olive oil and avocado oil is. Smaller chain means it spends less time in the stomach. It doesn't require as much mechanical work of the stomach, and it also doesn't require typical hormones that are secreted by the stomach to break down other fat molecules. It also is very easily brought in by the GI tract, so it's like instant calories, right? Instant calories going in. And MCT oil doesn't really taste like anything. You can't cook with it, so it's not something that you can use to make meals, but I tell patients to drizzle it on afterwards. So mix it into the pasta, the rice, the mashed potatoes, pureed vegetables, all of those things. You're just bumping up those calories quite easily and making it still something palatable, tasty, easy to tolerate. Nut butters are another great one. If you're able to tolerate whole nuts, fine, but oftentimes, again, pureed, broken down nut butters work a lot better. And if the fat is an issue, there are actually several brands on the market that make powdered forms of nut butters. And actually they're at the grocery store. I've seen them, or you can go to like vitamin shop type places where they sell just vitamins. They will definitely carry these powders. And what's great is they're fat free, but they still have the calories and they still have the protein, and it still tastes like peanut butter, almond butter. And you can easily add that into things. Or if you're like me and you just love eating peanut butter off the spoon, you can reconstitute it with either water or MCT oil so that you still get that mouthfeel you're looking for, but you don't have any symptoms associated with it. So I hope some of these tips are going to be helpful for you guys. And as I mentioned, protein is the most important thing. If you walk away from nothing else from this lecture, hopefully the big thing you walk away with is more protein, okay? Every cancer patient I have ever seen needs more protein than what they're taking in, because we all think we're doing enough, and then when we calculate it out, it isn't. The other thing I always like to remind patients of is we can only absorb so much protein at once. So instead of trying to do, like 2 big scoops of protein powder that has 40 grams of protein in one shake, we can only absorb maybe at the most 30 grams. And if you're a smaller woman like me, I'm probably only able to absorb at most 25 grams every 2 hours. We'd be better off separating those protein powder scoops over the course of the day so that we have the best possibility of bringing it in and laying it down on our lean body mass. So in terms of different protein sources, I find that ground lean animal proteins work the best. Again, particle size and fat, so we're reducing both of those. And chicken and turkey are perfect for this. Flaky fish, and if you need to go towards more of the white fish and not the fatty fishes to get rid of that fat irritant, that's great. I'm a big fan of tofu. I think a lot of people overlook it. As long as you don't have any hormone-based cancer, you can do organic tofu. The silken form makes a really lovely pudding that I find patients really enjoy. Again, nuts, nut butters, seed butters all work. For patients who tolerate dairy, doing non-fat, low-fat yogurts, kefirs, and cheeses, this also adds some good probiotics into the body. And of course, if you are lactose intolerant, you can always go for a lactose-free version of these. There are so many good brands on the market now. Or if you're someone who notices that even with lactose-free, you don't feel good, consider going for goat or sheep instead of going for the cow versions. You may tolerate those better because it's a different protein structure. I have a lot of patients who think they can't do beans because they're afraid it's too fibrous. If you puree the beans down into a hummus or a bean dip, it usually is well tolerated. So those are another great way to get them in. And then of course, again, if we're really struggling, the appetite is poor, we can always go to protein powders and protein drinks. And those are always great options for us. So in terms of protein powders and protein drinks, the biggest hurdle that I see patients fall into, or the biggest stumbling block, I guess I should say, is that they make the mistake, and this is a logical mistake to make, of just going to the grocery store and picking up whatever protein shake is available. So I have a lot of patients show up to my office and they've purchased like Ensure Original or Boost Original, and they don't realize that those only have a little over 100 calories and about 8 grams of protein. And for the same volume, Ensure makes one that has like 350 calories and 30 grams of protein, and so does Boost. So you can easily take in that same amount of volume, but you can be getting double the calories and triple the protein. And that's what we want, right? We want to maximize our nutrition per volume ratio. So my rule of thumb is when you are picking a protein shake, if you're going to buy a pre-made one, make sure it has at least 250 calories and at least 15 grams of protein. Otherwise, you are wasting that volume. Okay. The other thing I always like to point out is, if possible, drink them between meals, not with your meal, because it's going to displace some of the room that you have for food. So we'd much rather use it as a snack or as a dessert instead of as part of the meal. Of course, if you're having a really bad day, maybe you're really not feeling good, it's really hard to get any solid food in. This is when you could have 4 to 6 of these in a day and it would cover your needs. We just don't want that to be always, but know that you have it for those days that are really, really tough, right? And as I'm sure you can guess, liquids are much easier on the body than solids. So liquids move through the stomach even when the stomach is struggling. They've actually shown in research studies that for people who are having slow emptying of their stomach for different reasons, liquids still move at the same speed. It's solids and fat that get caught up in the stomach. So when you're in need, use a liquid form. It's an easier way to get those calories in. One thing I wanted to point out, and this didn't exist a couple years ago, is beyond protein shakes, we now have something called protein waters. And I have to say, I'm in love with these. One, they are no fat. They have 0 fat, so we don't have to worry about that being a trigger. 2, they are hydrating. It's just water and it has protein powder added to it. So instead of it being water, which we love, we need it for hydration status, but water, as you know, has no calories, no protein, no nothing. If we can add protein to it, these protein drinks have 20 grams of protein per bottle and about 80 calories. So you just got in something you needed anyways, water, but now you got it in with some good calories and some good protein coming your way. So I love those. Also, another thing I often tell my patients to do is to buy an unflavored, unsweetened protein powder, okay? And whether you choose a vegan option such as rice protein or hemp protein or pea protein is up to you, or if you want to go for the ones that are the easiest to mix into foods, you can do a lactose-free whey isolate, or you could do an egg white version. These are just powder fine and they mix really easily into foods. And then you can add them into anything that's liquid or semi-solid, regardless of whether it's sweet or savory. So if all you're tolerating is soup, why not add some unflavored, unsweetened protein powder to your soup? You just bumped up the calories and the protein. It's going to taste exactly the same, but you know that you're getting more nutrition. We can do the same thing with pureed fruits, pureed vegetables. You can add it into a milk or milk alternative before you put cereal in. You can bake with it. Okay. You can add it to sauces that you're going to be putting on something. So there's lots of ways you can be creative with using protein powder. So that is like a staple that I offer to my patients. And just to show you, because a lot of people want to go the more natural route, and there's nothing wrong with that. But just so you know, there are a lot of pre-made shakes out there that are not Boost and Ensure that have great ingredient profiles. So look around, you may find something you like. But if you want to make stuff at home, which is a wonderful thing, if you've got the energy or you have a caregiver or you are a caregiver who's willing to make these shakes, I just wanted to show how easily we can add up calories and protein without having to use a ton of volume. So if we go for about 8 ounces of milk or protein-rich milk alternative, and 8 ounces is about like this. It's not that big. We can add 1 scoop of whatever protein powder you want, unflavored, 1 tablespoon of nut butter or one of those nut butter powders, a half a banana, and if you want and tolerate it, a little bit of cocoa powder, and you get this nice smoothie that's going to taste like a milkshake. It's going to give you 360 calories and 33 grams of protein. Pretty good, right? And again, that's a little more protein than maybe you can absorb. So you could even divide the shake in half and drink it throughout the day. And it would be a nice way to get some of that nutrition in. So I hope that was helpful. Again, I'm going to be answering questions at the end. So if you have any, feel free to put them in the Q&A. But we're going to move into symptom management now. So for symptom management, we're lucky enough at UCLA to have a radiation oncology dietitian. And oftentimes I will see the patient first. Once they get diagnosed, we'll kind of get them set up, get any malnutrition under wraps, and then I will send them on to our lovely radiation oncology dietitian, Lydia, who will then help patients get through chemoradiation. And I actually was lucky enough to get all of this information from her. And so I just wanted to go over some of the common symptoms that we see during chemoradiation. So nausea and vomiting is very common. And a lot of these things I've already said, and you're going to notice that a lot of the tips I say can be applicable to multiple things that can be going on. So hopefully I'm drumming it in that smaller, more frequent meals, separating liquids from meals can be very, very helpful. Making sure that we're not getting dehydrated, that we're getting enough fluid in, and when possible, make that fluid nutrient dense. And then especially with nausea and vomiting, blander foods, drier foods, things like saltine crackers, oyster crackers, pasta, rice, toast, can be really comforting for that because it absorbs stomach acid. So kind of makes it easier to quell that nausea and hopefully keep vomiting from happening. And again, if that's kind of where we are, this is when something like a protein water can be helpful because we need to get that protein in somehow. And if we're really not feeling good and we need to use carbohydrates to help quell those symptoms, using protein powders and using protein waters is a way to bump up those carbohydrate-rich foods and make sure we're getting that nutrition and the fluid that we need. Also, we see taste changes a lot with chemotherapy. So one easy solution, especially if you're getting a metallic taste in the mouth, is to switch over to plastic instead of metal utensils. You may find at this time that red meats don't taste very good because they're rich in iron, so there's always a bit of a metallic taste to them. You also may have a dulling of the taste buds, and this may require that you season your foods a little bit more than you normally would. Or if you haven't heard of the FASS chart, this is probably the coolest thing I think I learned from our radiation oncology dietitian. So I don't know if you've seen this, but I just learned about this about 2 years ago, and I just think it's so useful. So regardless of what taste changes you're having, whether things taste too sweet or they taste too bland or they're too spicy, by using the FASS, which you can imagine means fats, acid, salt, and sweet, right? So we can use one of these different taste enhancers to either bump up or tame down different types of taste changes we're having. So I think this is really cool. And it may seem weird that if you're eating vegetables and they taste too bitter, that you're supposed to add maple syrup, but I promise it works. It's kind of amazing. So I hope that this will be helpful for those of you who have experienced taste changes or who may have that in the future as part of your chemoradiation treatment. And then this is back into my wheelhouse. So as I said, I'm a digestive health expert. So working through constipation and diarrhea can be difficult. With constipation, sometimes we can use something simple like a prune juice. Even sometimes something like apple juice can get things moving. Just making sure the patient is well hydrated can be helpful. If we're not eating meals regularly or we're not taking in enough calories, that alone can make us more constipated. So making sure that there's meal timings that patients are hitting can be really helpful. And then of course, if we're able to add in fiber, if that's tolerated, which it's not always, then we will try and do that. But remember that during these kind of treatments that are going on and these kind of temporary symptoms that are showing up, if we need to go for a laxative or something like that, the doctor will make a recommendation, and it's okay during this time for a short period to go on something like a Colbase or a Miralax, especially if it's going to allow better quality of life as we're dealing with other things that are going on. And in terms of diarrhea, I would say the biggest misstep I see here is when we have diarrhea, it's kind of our natural instinct to not eat and just drink a ton of fluid, right? And we go, okay, well, if I don't put anything solid in, nothing's going to come out the other end. I'll drink a bunch of clear liquids, and in a day or two, it will resolve. But remember that if the diarrhea is being caused by chemotherapy or radiation, it may not go away that easily. And so now we've just missed out on multiple meals to get multiple nutrients in. We're at higher risk of losing weight, and that's only going to make us less strong and able to take care of ourselves. So instead of stopping eating, we really don't want to do that. In the beginning, just to kind of calm things down, going towards a more bland diet can be really helpful, right? We all hear of the BRAT diet, which we give to children, which is bananas, rice, applesauce, and toast, can kind of pull things together. Something I'll do is I'll look for what we call highly osmotic foods that are sometimes in the diet. And what I mean by that is foods that naturally attract water and pull it through the GI tract. And those include the sugars of fructose, lactose, and sugar alcohols. And I list some of them for you guys: the apple juice, sorbitol, and mannitol. So I will look for those types of things in a patient's diet to see, is there possibly something that's making their diarrhea more severe? And then we can roll those back and find good alternative foods for them instead. If the diarrhea is really significant, meaning more than 5 bowel movements a day for longer than a couple of days in a row, I'm probably going to recommend an oral rehydration solution. And this is what we call an isotonic or like balanced solution. Doesn't have any of those, variables that pull water with them. And it helps the body retain fluid and not lose it to the stool. And I'll actually give you a recipe for this at the end of the lecture. All right, so let's go into after surgery. So with my esophageal cancer patients, generally speaking, from what I've seen at UCLA, is our patients during surgery, they will have a tube placed for food, and they will be on tube feeding for about 2 weeks post-surgery, assuming everything's going really well, which for most patients it really does, and we're able to start weaning them off of the tube feeds around the 2-week mark. So we always start with clear liquids, and that's a way to just ensure that the anatomy is working really well, that everything is functioning as we expect and they're ready for oral intake. And then we'll advance to what's called a full liquid diet, which is things like smoothies and things that are thicker liquids basically. And then we get to move into a soft diet. And this happens within about a week. It's pretty quick. The only time that wouldn't happen is, again, if the patient wasn't able to regain any lost weight, or we see that there's real malnutrition, then we may continue the tube feed while we're bringing in some oral intake. If the patient, however, was able to maintain their weight, which is wonderful, then for every one of those oral, so PO means oral, sorry, I should have written that out, protein drinks that are at least 250 calories and at least 15 grams of protein, I get to remove one tube feeding formula. So we can very quickly wean them off the tube feed, which is always really exciting for the patient and for me. And just in general, because there's new anatomy that's happening, we want to make sure that we're thinking about, okay, so with this new anatomy post-surgery, what are some of the things that could be going on? So for instance, there's a smaller gastric pouch. And so there's reduced capacity for food going in, even more so than the volume that we could get in before surgery. So this could lead to some early fullness, which means that we really want to do those smaller, more frequent meals. Also, we lose that connection point called the LES, or lower esophageal sphincter, between what used to be the esophagus and the stomach, right? And that was like a valve that would open and close and allow food to move through. And so what we want to do is make sure we really separate our liquids from our meals, and we make everything as nutrient dense as possible. The other thing is, because we don't have that valve to stop stuff coming back up this direction, we want to make sure we're using gravity to our best effect, meaning gravity is pushing this way. So if we lie flat, or I also have patients who will try and bend over at the waist, all of a sudden gravity is pushing things this direction, and you're more likely to regurgitate or have more reflux, which we really don't want to do. For our gastric cancer patients, after surgery, again, there's lots of new anatomy changes that can happen, and a lot of it depends on what type of surgery was done for the patient. But generally speaking, there's a smaller pouch of some kind. Parts of the small intestine have probably been bypassed. So there can again be this early fullness. There can be a lowered ability to tolerate fat, or even in the beginning, a little bit of lactose intolerance. And this is due to the fact that the enzyme lactase, which breaks apart the sugar, lactose, in our dairy products, comes from that top part of the small intestine, which can be resected, right? And often it's still attached, but it can take time after surgery for that part of the anatomy to figure out how to continue making the enzyme and delivering it to the location where it needs to go to help break down this sugar. So it might only be temporary, but switching over to lactose-free products after surgery can be really helpful for managing things like gas and bloating and diarrhea. We also, again, so you're hearing the same types of things, drinking between meals instead of with meals, sitting upright after meals for at least 60 minutes. I actually recommend taking a walk, so nothing strenuous, but just a walk around the house or a walk around the block helps encourage gravity moving things down the digestive tract. So all of these can be pretty helpful. And then, of course, we want to talk about dumping syndrome. So I'm not going to pretend that I am a diabetes expert or a glucose expert, so I'm not going to go too deep into this. But dumping syndrome, for those of you who are not familiar with it, basically is when the small intestine has to stretch to accommodate a large amount of food, usually simple carbohydrates, coming in, and it pulls water out of the bloodstream and into the small intestine, which causes this swelling. And then there's changes in hormones that happen, and it all happens so fast that it can lead to symptoms like nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea. And this is usually within a short period of time after eating. So we call that early dumping syndrome. There is a later dumping syndrome that happens several hours later. And this is when there's a rapid rise in sugar moving into the bloodstream, and it all of a sudden can cause like heart palpitations and dizziness and mental fatigue and all that kind of stuff. So if these symptoms are sounding familiar to you and you are someone who is post gastrectomy, make sure you talk with your doctor about this. Other things that you can be doing is limiting simple carbohydrates. So what do I mean by simple carbohydrates? I'm talking about sugary foods, cookies, candies, cakes. I'm also talking about fruit. So instead of just having fruit on its own, we want some fruit in the diet. One, we don't want to do a big fruit smoothie. But if we can do a little bit of fruit and pair it with something like a protein or possibly a fat, that can help with better absorption rates. And it can also allow a slowdown of how quickly those sugars leave the small intestine and enter into the bloodstream. Of course, we want to avoid alcohol. And when we're able to, bringing in a little bit more fiber can also slow down how quickly this whole thing happens. All right, and so let's finish up with some nutrient concerns. So this is a chart that was given to me when I was in school, my God, like 10 years ago. And I loved multiple things about this chart. One, I loved the fact that it is a tube, right? That our GI tract is one connected tube, but yet all of these different parts and pieces of this tube, they work in concert with each other, but they're also in charge of wildly different things. But to make sure that we don't get completely deficient all the time, especially if we have, a period when we're not eating as well, you'll notice that most things are absorbed in multiple parts of the GI tract. It's not just in one place. There's just a few key things that are only absorbed in one place, and I'm going to talk about that next. But for those of you who have had, when I say an endoscopic resection, it could be from the esophagus, it could be from the stomach. This can affect, of course, absorption that's happening in the stomach. If there's a subtotal or what we call a partial gastrectomy, we're moving more into the duodenum, which is that top part of the small intestine that you see. If we've got what's called a Roux-en-Y, then we're also looking deeper into the GI tract and possibly the jejunum. And depending on the type of total gastrectomy, there can even be accessory organs that can be involved in all of this. So what does that mean for labs? So based on current recommendations, these are some of the labs that you may want to bring up to your doctor, or if you see a dietitian, these are the types of labs that I order the first time I see a patient after surgery. So I put this into I usually see a patient about 2 weeks after surgery. I will input these labs and tell them to go in about a month. Okay, so we want a little bit of time after surgery for their anatomy to settle. And then we want to get an idea of what are their levels looking like, how are they doing? And you'll notice that I put especially, and that's because the stomach is the only place where copper can be absorbed. It's a key place for iron, and it's also a key place for B12 because there's a protein called intrinsic factor that is released by the stomach. It binds to B12 and it pulls it through the rest of the GI tract to the last part of the small intestine where it's then absorbed. And so when the stomach has been altered, it can make it much more difficult for these nutrients to be absorbed. So just because I list all these labs up here, I guarantee you're not going to be deficient in all of these things, but we want to be on top of deficiencies. We want to know about them before they become problematic and you start to have symptoms. So I recommend having it done, again, about a month after surgery. Depending if there's any deficiencies, we want to do what we call repletion, which means we take the next 2 to 3 months to supplement and get you up to the right dose. Then we want to check labs again. If we're still not where we need to be, we replete further. If you are where you need to be, then we want to actually check again in 6 months and see where you're at. So I recommend checking every 6 months to a year, even once everything is going as we expect, to make sure that things continue to go as we expect. Okay, and you can see there's other things depending on what part of the small intestine has been resected that we may want to pay just a little extra attention to. All right, and so in terms of these nutrient concerns, I find that liquid and powdered multivitamins tend to go over better than capsules because capsules are harder to break down. They can be a little bit triggering for some of the symptoms we described. The only thing with liquid and powdered multivitamins is there's a sugar in them usually, right? So we have to be careful of what sugar it is, especially if there's any dumping syndrome. And we also want to look out for sugar alcohols like sorbitol, mannitol, maltitol, all these OL ending sugars, and fructose, because they can lead to a lot of GI upset. Also with B12 and iron, it's always a question of, is oral intake going to be enough, or are we going to have to use IV on occasion for patients? And DEXA BMD stands for bone mineral density exam. So we want to be checking your bones to make sure you're absorbing your calcium and that we get in the way of any potential osteoporosis or osteopenia. Another supplement I like and I will often use with patients, especially if they've got some diarrhea, is I might give them L-glutamine powder. And I'm not going to go too deep into this. And this is really something I always ask for the hematologist, oncologist to weigh in on this before I ever start. But it can be really helpful for mucositis, which can be a side effect of chemo and radiation. It also helps with stimulating muscle growth, and it can help with any diarrhea side effects. As I mentioned, an oral rehydration solution can also be really helpful. And this is a very simple recipe. So you would add these ingredients to 1 liter of water, and you've got your own homemade oral rehydration solution. There are also oral rehydration solution packets available that you can buy at the grocery store, where you literally like dump the pouch into 16 ounces or 32 ounces of water, and there's your oral rehydration solution ready to go. So I hope that you learned a lot. I hope that there was some good information here for you. I think the most important thing is that the sooner we can get nutrition involved, the better, because then we can stave off malnutrition. We can really encourage healing and recovery from any treatments. We can help to manage symptoms, and we can make sure that we're taking care of any nutrient deficiencies that might show up. Also, we want to make sure that protein is the big key word that we're focused on. So with that, I'm happy to open it up to any questions that there might be.
Thank you so much, Nancy Jaffe. That was a great and informative and really good examples. Thank you so much for that presentation.
Sure.
We do have a few questions that came in, and we had a few that were submitted ahead of time.
Great.
So I'll try to pick some of these out here. One of the first questions that came in, and it might be a little off topic, was about asking about taking pain meds for a sore after an esophagectomy.
Yes. So I'm going to start by saying I'm not a doctor, so I actually am not legally allowed to comment on medications. What was the specific question about using pain medications?
It's an anonymous person, but if they want to enter more in the question, we could know more.
Sure. I can just say, usually, again, if someone has had an esophagectomy, they're usually going to be on like a J-tube feed for a couple weeks after surgery. A lot of medications can be crushed, blended into either their formula or added to some water and put in through the tube. But you really want to talk with your doctor about that one, not only because some medications are not good to do after surgery, but beyond that, some are going to have GI side effects. So for instance, a lot of our narcotics, our pain medications, can be quite constipating. And especially during surgery, they're putting all sorts of stuff in you, and that alone can cause some constipation. We really don't want you to be constipated. So I would say make sure you really have a good discussion with the prescribing doctor.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, we have another one here. Can you talk a little bit about food that helps build red blood cells?
Sure. So again, I would question, are we talking about, I should say there's many reasons why we can have low red blood cells. And the question I would be having is, I'd want to look at the labs and go, so is it just the RBC or red blood cell count in a CBC, which is the lab that they would test that with? Is that the only thing that's low, or are we seeing low numbers in the hematocrit, the hemoglobin, the MCV, the MCH? If we're seeing low numbers across the board, it usually is pointing us towards an iron deficiency. And then we would want to go towards iron-rich foods that are well tolerated. I have to say, one of my favorite new products, and I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about products. Am I allowed to talk about products?
Would say maybe, probably.
Okay.
Yes. The answers come in. Yes, you can.
Okay, great. So there's something called the Lucky Iron Fish or Lucky Iron Leaf. It comes from Canada. Don't buy it from Amazon. Go to the actual website, buy it from Canada. What I love about this product, it is basically a piece of cast iron that's in the shape of a fish or a leaf. And all you do is you throw it into anything that's liquid. You heat it for 10 minutes and it infuses that dish with iron. So if you're someone like me who doesn't really like eating animal protein, which is, of course, the highest amount of iron comes from those sources, this is a great way that you can infuse otherwise iron-free or low iron dishes with a ton of iron. Okay. But beyond that, if it's just the red blood cells alone that are low, I would be really questioning why that is. I would even be looking to see if there may be a different form of anemia going on, such as B12 or folate related anemia, or is there actually anemia of chronic disease or non-specific anemia, which can actually come because of inflammation from the cancer. So it's not an easy question to answer, and I'm sorry I can't just give you specific foods to do, but I think there needs to be more investigation to understand why the red blood cells are low. But if it is iron, go for the lucky iron fish.
Okay, thank you. And then there's one more point with that, and it mentions blood draws for stage 4. Is that the same concern?
Again, so I don't know what they mean in terms are they asking for what specific types of labs I might want to order for someone who has a more advanced form of cancer, which is possible. I don't actually do a lot of nutrition blood draws at diagnosis unless I'm noticing that the diet is already restricted down. So for instance, if the patient is already struggling to eat, we're not working on supplementation yet, they have a vegan or vegetarian lifestyle that they do, or they've got lots of restrictions for other reasons, then I may want to order some nutrition-based labs. Otherwise, the things I'm mainly going to be looking out for in the beginning is going to be that CBC and CMP. Those are going to be the big ones. And then after surgery is when I order all of those other labs. That's when like my part with the labs really takes place.
Okay, thank you. I hope that helped answer that question.
So too.
There's somebody here asking for a bit of clarification, and it's, do all of these dietary recommendations apply to all GI cancer patients, including stage 4, not eligible for surgery? And they mentioned my husband had a stage 4 with ornamental caking and I'm probably going to say this next word wrong, ascites?
Ascites.
Yeah, thank you. In the peritoneum, and also has bowel obstructions.
Oh, wow. Okay. So we still want to try and get increased calories and increased protein for a patient like that so that we're not losing the lean body mass, because that's what's going to keep them strong as they're moving forward. But at the same time, because of a mass, that's going to dramatically change what types of foods we can use. So some people use the term low residue. I prefer the term low fiber. And really it's about specific types of fiber that we might pick out for the patient. So for instance, the term soluble fiber, which you may have heard of, means that it acts kind of like a sponge as it moves through the body. It absorbs water. It's able to get through tight spaces. It's not going to create further obstruction. Whereas something that's insoluble, which you can think of as like a bristle brush, is going to be very scrapey and scratchy, and that's going to create a hairball and get caught up places. So with a patient like that, I would be giving them lists of foods that are going to be the easiest on the GI tract. And we may also have to be thinking about whether or not we actually need to be going towards more of a liquid pureed blenderized type of diet to make sure we're not, because the last thing we want to do is create an obstruction that lands the patient in the hospital. So I would say the general guidelines that I gave, yes, the smaller, more frequent meals, separating liquids from meals, making your liquids really nutrient dense. Yes, all of that applies, but we might want to get more specific and more individualized for a patient like that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try, since we're getting close to the end, I want to try to combine a couple of questions here. So there's a few questions about chewable vitamins, children's multivitamins. Is that a good plan? And then also a few people asking about supplements for bone density.
Yeah, so technically a lot of dietitians will just say go buy a Flintstone vitamin. There are adult versions on the market that I like a little bit better. The big thing with chewables is because they're trying to make them taste good, they often don't contain all 8 B vitamins, and they might be missing out on some of our minerals. So to be honest, I generally go for powders and liquids instead because I find that they are more nutrient dense. But if you've got a dietitian on your team and they either tell you to take a chewable or they're willing to look at the list of nutrition facts or supplement facts that are on the back, they can help guarantee it's got everything that you need in it. And what was the second part of that question? I'm sorry.
It was about children's vitamins and then bone density supplements.
Yes. Okay. So this is a topic I could talk about all day, and I'll try and make it short. I am not the biggest fan of calcium supplements. The reason being that especially in women and especially in postmenopausal women, there have been multiple studies and fairly conclusive evidence that too much calcium supplementation, especially of a calcium carbonate form, can start to lay calcium on the heart, which can cause calcification, which we know can be a precursor to other types of cardiovascular disease. So what I recommend is we do as much food forms of calcium and vitamin D as we possibly can. And then if we need to supplement, we do an elemental form of calcium, which could either be like a hydroxyapatite, or there's actually ones on the market, like Jarrow makes one called Bone Up that actually is elemental calcium. So you know exactly how much calcium you're getting. And I try and keep it below 500 milligrams in my patients and then get the rest of their needs, which is usually around 1400 milligrams calcium per day from food sources. And then of course we need to make sure that your vitamin D is looking really good. So those are the biggest ones that I'm looking at. I know a lot of other providers might talk about, you know, vitamin K, or they may talk about strontium, or they may talk about boron. When I work with our geriatric team at UCLA and talk with our experts on bone mineral density, they constantly tell me, as long as they're eating a varied diet, they're going to get those other trace minerals. We really need to be focusing on the calcium and vitamin D for bone health.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have so many good questions coming in. Going to try to get in as many as I can. Let's see, there's another one. This one might be quick. It was about Tums. Is Tums okay for indigestion?
Again, it's technically a medication. Even though it's an over-the-counter form, I would always leave that to the doctor to decide. That is 100% calcium carbonate. I'm just going to point that out. So what I just said may apply in that circumstance. But what I would be wondering is if you're having significant enough symptoms that you're needing to pop Tums all the time, it may mean that the doctor actually needs to prescribe a proton pump inhibitor or an H2 blocker to help manage your symptoms. So I think that's a great conversation to have with your physician.
Okay, thank you. And then this one, I think you covered a little bit before too, but maybe they just want some clarification. Can you get enough protein in a plant-based diet, and what food should be the focus?
Yes, you absolutely can. I will say that a lot of the cancer dietitians really try and discourage that if you're willing to do some amount of, you know, eggs or dairy, or, you know, even lean ground meats or fish, to try and get those in the diet if you're willing to. But technically, yes, we can go towards things like organic soy products. We can use our vegan protein powder options and vegan shake options. We can use our pureed beans and legumes. We can use our nut butters, right? And then grains do have protein, especially things like quinoa and oats. So if we have to go to like a pulverized form, like a cream of quinoa or an instant oat, there are ways to get that protein in. And then again, you can add some unflavored, unsweetened protein powder into those and bulk that up. So yes, the answer is it is doable. It takes a little bit more effort and a little bit more awareness on the patient's part, but it's definitely a doable thing.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see. Another one we have here is, we never had copper level measured after an LI surgery, and what symptoms the patient would have if the copper level was low.
Yeah, and that's a tough one. So copper can actually be low in part because of iron deficiency. So iron and copper kind of play in the same field. It can also be low as a side effect of zinc. So I would personally want all of those labs checked kind of in coordination to see. But the main thing it can cause is kind of like mental changes. So trouble with cognition. There can also be gait changes, walking issues, but it really takes quite a deficiency before you're going to start having symptoms from copper. What's nice is we don't need a lot of copper in order to get our body going. So even if you're taking like a multivitamin, make sure it has about 1 to 2 milligrams of copper, and you should be good even if your anatomy is struggling to absorb it. But I would recommend, when possible, have an RBC copper level taken would be good.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any dietary recommendations for peripheral neuropathy from Platin?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is a tough one. So one thing I would say is I would want to make sure that none of the neuropathy is due to vitamin and mineral deficiencies, right? So likelihood is it's related to the treatment, but I would be checking things like B1, B6, which by the way, you have to be fasting when you go to the lab for B6 levels to be accurate, B12, zinc, copper, and vitamin E. So those would be the labs I would be looking at for neuropathy. And then depending on where the neuropathy is happening, if it's like mainly in your hands and your feet, unfortunately, there's not great diet to help with that. Sometimes adding in a little extra vitamin D or omega-3 can help, making sure you're getting adequate protein. Unfortunately, the best I can do as a dietitian to help with neuropathy is to make sure there's no deficiency associated with it. So sorry, I don't have great diet advice for that one.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Let's see. Here's another question. What is the allocation for meals? What percentage of the meal should be protein or carb and fats?
That's a great question. So out of your total calories for the day, protein is going to probably end up taking somewhere between 20 and 25% of your calories. Okay. And then we want to divide the rest up over carbohydrates and fats, which is going to leave somewhere between 40 and 55% for carbohydrates, and then the rest for fat, which is usually around 15 to 25%.
Okay.
But again, I wouldn't get too lost in the percentages as long as you're getting your grams of protein in and your total like amount of calories in, you're probably going to get enough of the other stuff.
Okay. And let's see, we might have time for maybe just one or two more. It says, Keith is asking, I'm finishing an 8th round FLOT and partial stomach resection for stage 3B gastric endocarcinoma with a clean CT. Are you aware of any data that have dietary correlations to cancer returning?
I mean, what we've shown isn't about necessarily cancer returning, but we've got a lot of information on cancer prevention, right? So there's been a lot of studies, especially in gastric cancer, that's showing that things like highly preserved foods. So whether it's things that are like salted fish or cured meats or salted fermented vegetables, small amounts of those things, okay. Big amounts of those in the diet, not great for gastric cancer. So I would be looking at the data on what kind of leads to cancer in the first place. So we know that there's higher rates with obesity, alcohol, smoking, consumption of red meat more than 3 times per week, processed meats more than a couple times a month at most, and then these salted foods. We also know that heading towards more of a Mediterranean plant-forward diet, by plant-forward, I do not mean plant-based, you don't have to be vegan or vegetarian, but by making more of what shows up on your plate plant and less of it coming from an animal, that's been showed as preventative for cancer. So that would be what I would say about trying to kind of keep recurrences from happening.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us today and having this great presentation. There are a lot of other good questions that have come in and we just don't have time to, and I know you have other things you need to get to today. So I want to point out to everybody that's joined, again, thank you for everyone who's joined and thank you for all the great questions. Aki has put her email in the chat. So if you haven't found the chat already, please do that. She wants you to email any of the questions you had that we didn't have time to answer today. So if you can go ahead and get that before leaving, if you don't already have her email. And again, thank you, Nancy Jaffe, and thank you to all our attendees today.
And I will make a PDF of these slides available. So I'll give them to Aki to post on the website. So you will have access to these slides afterwards. And then if you have interest in seeing a dietitian like myself, feel free to contact me at UCLA.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.